Andy Lulham, Chief Operating Officer of UK firm Verifymy, has been watching closely as age assurance legislation evolves worldwide. Today, he's here to bust some myths about age checks and weigh in on who's doing what right and where. I'm Joel McConvey. Welcome to the Biometric Update Podcast and to my conversation with Verifymy's Andy Lulham. Thank you for taking the time to join this morning. It's great to have you on the Biometric Update Podcast.
Pleasure.
So I want to get right to it and talk about age assurance in the UK and elsewhere. It certainly made its debut on the world stage, age assurance and the debate about age assurance. And the UK has sort of headlined that because of the Online Safety Act. So can you tell me, in your opinion, has this been a success so far?
I think it's been a bit of a mixed picture, to be honest. Where the regulatory frameworks have been clear and balanced and legally robust, I think implementation's gone fairly smoothly. And I think the UK that you mentioned around the Online Safety Act is a good example of that. Jurisdictions such as France, though, on the other hand, that's struggled with complexity, and the interplay in France with EU-level legislation such as the Digital Services Act adds further complexity and uncertainty, and adoption there has been far less comprehensive. And I think Arcom's limited engagement with the adult sector, for example, has compounded that. In the US, things are developing quickly. The Supreme Court's recent decision in Texas could trigger further state-level activity, I think. So I wouldn't be surprised to see a federal sort of regulatory framework on the horizon relatively soon. But either way, I suspect more adult sites will be implementing age checks as we move into next year in the US, and it's very much been a sort of piecemeal approach so far there. New York recently published a framework linked to the Safe for Kids Act. I think it's particularly promising, probably the most considered yet. They specify maximum false positive rates by age, which allows age estimation and age inference to be used responsibly, which reduces friction for users, but also maintaining safety. It recognises that a 17-and-a-half-year-old passing an 18-plus age check isn't the same level of risk as a 12-year-old doing so. So it feels sort of sensible and a pragmatic step forward. And in December, we've got the upcoming social media ban coming into force for children under 16 in Australia, which is the first sort of hard age gate for children's access to social platforms. And there'll be a lot of interested parties watching very closely as to what happens when that kicks in. So I think it's been a very mixed response. And I do think the Online Safety Act framework in the UK has been probably the biggest success so far.
So tell me a bit more about Ofcom's execution of it then, because you mentioned that Arcom in France hasn't maybe had the same level of engagement with the adult content industry. Has Ofcom done better at that? And also, I want to touch later on the social media ban, because that's something that Ofcom has expressed interest in and said, we're watching this.
Yeah, I think Ofcom's done a really good job with regards to the adult sector. They've made a really concerted effort to engage with the industry, and they've attended all the mainstream adult industry events, which I think is important. They've taken a collaborative approach rather than a standoffish approach, and that's not always an easy thing to do in some sectors. They've also been clear that enforcement or fines will follow where necessary, but their preference for dialogue and partnership and conversation has also been evident, which is, again, more pragmatic than elsewhere. Like, no regulation is ever perfect, but I think the framework feels more balanced. It supports child safety, and whilst also being mindful of privacy and user experience and the need for innovation. And ultimately in the UK, with Ofcom, the results speak for themselves. So I believe that most of the leading or most of the largest adult sites were compliant from day one. And now I believe all of the top 20 by size and something over 95 of the biggest 100 are now actively performing age checks. So there's other questions that have arisen around sort of consistency and anti-spoofing measures and liveness checks, and more scrutiny on the actual underlying mechanic will likely come next. But overall, I do think Ofcom's implementation set a really good foundation for the Online Safety Act here in the UK.
For all that it's been a success, there's still a ton of confusion and a ton of misunderstanding about the tech. A lot of people have a lot of hesitations particularly about facial biometrics. Tell me about the myths, the persistent and biggest myths about age assurance that you have encountered as this has rolled out.
I think the biggest myth is that an age check is the same as an identity check, which it definitely isn't. A relying platform only needs to know whether someone meets a required age threshold, so that could be 16 or more commonly 18, and not any information about who that person actually is. Age assurance providers don't share or store unnecessary personal data. They simply confirm a binary yes or no result as to the outcome of a age check. Many people also assume that you must submit an identity document, but that's just one option. Unlike an identity check where it's required, age can be determined using various data points and methods. It could just be an email address, it could be a mobile phone number, it could be a facial age estimation check, all without sharing additional information beyond what's strictly necessary. Another myth, I think, is that an age check must severely disrupt a user's experience, and some methods might require you to find or scan an identity document if you choose to do so, but others using just an email address or a mobile phone number to prove age can be completed in just a few seconds. It really doesn't have to impede someone from visiting their favorite website or app. It's just a logical, simple step to help safeguard children online and protect them from age-inappropriate content or products.
People still, nonetheless, seem unwilling to, well, I guess it's not unwillingness. People seem very terrified of sharing data now, any kind of data. And it's odd because we share data all the time. We will give our email address and our age to websites that, we want to get into if it's an alcohol thing or whatnot. But there seems to be a sort of particular roadblock with age verification, so to speak. And do you think that is because of the stigma around pornography? Why is this such a hard sell in a world where we give data away by the handful?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating paradox. And I think it is because of the association with the types of sector or the types of platform that need to complete age checks. And I also think that it's because it's new and it's something that most people are still relatively unfamiliar with. People share data constantly online. They post photos of themselves or their family or their friends. They enter credit card details or bank details to complete a purchase, or they readily punch in their passport details if they're booking a flight or a hotel. I do think that age checks provide a sort of provoke a disproportionate concern there. And as I said, I think it's to do with the association, and age checks are often linked to sensitive or adult content, which creates a different kind of scrutiny, even though the age check solutions themselves are highly privacy preserving and don't pass any data onto a relying platform. In reality, most modern age assurance systems should use zero knowledge proofs, meaning the platform only learns whether someone meets an age threshold and nothing else. So I do think it's the sectors and the recency of these requirements being the trigger for more concern from the general public.
Do you think we'll get to a point where it's legislated that you have to use ZKPs or a double-blind method? Do you think we're moving towards that becoming the norm?
I think there's a good chance it will head that way. I think it's unnecessary for other PII to be passed on to a relying platform other than a sort of zero knowledge proof response. The technology certainly exists, and if it's proven to work at scale, then I see no reason why the most data minimization and privacy by design mechanic wouldn't come out in as the sort of mainstream requirements in these types of legislation.
Let's talk about Verifymy for a minute. Obviously, as this legislation rolls out worldwide, the market for providers has grown. How does Verifymy set out to differentiate itself in this sort of exploding market for age verification and age assurance?
But it's natural that the market is going to expand as regulation matures. But the fundamentals remain the same for me. Like an age check must be sufficiently accurate, whilst at the same time introducing minimal friction for a user. And they are two core principles that Verifymy sort of holds really close to our technology. Our key differentiator is our email-based age inference method, which uses AI to determine likely age from an email's existing digital footprint. It's deployed by some of the world's biggest companies, and it is particularly attractive for platforms that already collect and authenticate a user's email address during an account creation process, which is the case for most social platforms, for example, which means that they can verify the age of a logged-in user without needing to collect any additional data whatsoever, provided there's a valid legal basis for doing so, of course. The user doesn't have to supply anything beyond what they already have done to join the platform. No new steps, no added friction. But of course, we continue to innovate. But innovation base can never stop, and neither do we at Verifymy.
I think it's fascinating to me to watch the language of the sector evolve. Age inference is a term that really I only started hearing maybe the end of last year. It's been around, but it has now sort of been adopted by the Age Verification Providers Association, by the Age Assurance Technology Trial, as this third category, joining age estimation and age verification. Do you think there's more work to be done in clarifying all this stuff for people?
I do actually, yes. And even within the industry, the terminology can be confusing, especially since different jurisdictions seem to use some terms inconsistently. Originally, when I first joined Verifymy 5 years ago, pretty much everything related to the term age verification, but quite quickly it evolved into the broader age assurance term, with verification and estimation becoming the subcategories. And you're absolutely right. For the last 6 to 12 months or so, age inference has emerged as a third sort of distinct approach. But I actually think there is some logic and sense around that. And those distinctions make sense. So a verification method requires an actual date of birth, which would often be extracted from an identity document. Estimation uses biometric analysis, such as facial features, voice or hand movements, things that change as an individual gets older and becomes more mature. And inference determines likely age from existing signals like an email address or a mobile account history. So I do think more consistency is needed. The recently developed ISO and IEEE international standards in age assurance, they adopt these three categories. And I think that's why you've seen this language or terminology come out in the Australian age assurance trial and some of the more recently published regulatory frameworks. And this should help align understanding globally, and ultimately, if it reduces confusion for regulators, relying parties and users themselves, then it can only be a good thing.
Let's talk a bit more about that standard. That's going to be the result of a lot of work, a lot of time. What is that going to mean to Verifymy to have that existing ISO standard out there that can be pointed to as a baseline?
We advocate for international standards, and it creates a flaw in terms of the accuracy and the consistency, and that can only be a good thing to uphold. You'll see that new pieces of regulation and independent certification processes will rapidly start to point towards these standards. Mean there's going to be more consistency across how different methods of completing age checks can be measured from an accuracy perspective. So we'll be adapting to that, but the technology that we build is already aligned with the requirements of these standards.
let's talk about VPNs. VPNs are the big issue that a lot of people point to when they say, well, you're implementing all this age assurance technology, and then people are just getting around it with the VPN. What's your take on a solution to this problem?
Well, VPNs are a double-edged sword. They have legitimate uses, but they also create loopholes in regulatory systems. I think, firstly, it's worth noting that the use of VPNs doesn't absolve a platform of its legal responsibilities to prevent children from accessing age-restricted content. And regulators have also been very clear that promoting or enabling VPN circumvention will not be tolerated. Ipsos, a polling company here in the UK, published some research, I think it was 4 weeks after the onset of the Online Safety Act. They found that 7 in 10 supported age checks in general for adult content, but only 7% of those surveyed said they had downloaded or purchased a VPN in response, suggesting the issue may be smaller than some fear, particularly given that a high percentage of those would have been adult users anyway. I also think that, ironically, those trying to bypass checks using VPNs may also be sharing more personal data with an uncertified third-party VPN provider than they would in completing a simple privacy-preserving age check with an audited age check provider. And paid VPNs obviously include the provision of accounts and payment details. Free VPN providers are not going to be providing their service for free without enabling monetization in other ways, most likely related to the data that they've collected from their users too. But there are also technical mitigations like proper geofencing and VPN detection tools, which are widely used in sectors such as online gambling and could be incorporated into platforms' tech stack when it comes to age checks too. But ultimately, no system is perfect, and some determined individuals will always look for a workaround. But if regulation significantly reduces underage exposure to adult content, for example, then that's a major step forward for child safety, and I think that's ultimately a good thing.
This is obviously a sector that's still evolving by the minute, by the day, and it may still change drastically. It may look completely different in, say, 3 years. Do you have any predictions or thoughts on how the future of age assurance might look in, let's say, 3 years?
It's a very good question, and I wish I had a crystal ball that I could accurately gaze into. I think there'll be two main dimensions of change ahead. Firstly, regulatory, but then technologically as well. And on the regulatory side, I think the direction of travel is definitely towards more comprehensive requirements, particularly in developed markets such as Europe, the US, Australia, for individuals to prove age before accessing restricted or age-sensitive content, whether that's 18 plus for adult material or 13 or 16 for social media, video gaming, live streaming, and so on. Over time, I expect more alignment across jurisdictions to simplify compliance for platforms and their customers. We mentioned the international standards earlier, and I think they'll play a really central role in that. From a tech perspective, I think age assurance checks will continue to become smoother and faster and more user-friendly. Identity documents will increasingly give way to behavioural or inferred or biometric signals. And I also think that if we're having this conversation in 2 or 3 years' time, then reusability will also be key. I expect there'll be interoperable networks and reusable age tokens that prevent the need for a user to complete repeated checks as they move between platforms or apps. A one-time privacy-preserving proof used across different trusted services feels like the logical future. It'll be efficient for users, compliant for businesses, and safe for children too. So I don't think in 2 or 3 years' time, if you were moving from your favoured social platform to an adult site to purchasing some liquor, et cetera, you'll be completing new age checks at each website. I just don't think that's particularly sustainable or user-friendly.
That sort of leads to the specter, if you will, of digital ID in the UK. Keir Starmer has been pushing this, and in a sense, digital ID and digital wallets are closely related to age assurance and age verification. So what are your thoughts on this latest attempt to roll out digital ID? Do you think this is going to be a success where others have failed?
I think it could go either way. There's been a huge amount of sort of press attention on the proposals over the last month or two since they were announced. I think there'll be a lot of interesting developments around the role between the private sector, particularly if a UK digital ID becomes mandated in order to be able to work in the UK, as is currently the plan. I think if everyone has a government-issued reusable digital identity on their device, it's definitely a very credible way of quickly proving your age, whether that's for a government service or another type of platform. What remains to be seen is how much confidence users have using a government-issued identity to prove their age to access adult content or a huge social network, for example. I suspect, certainly initially, that users will be far less willing to do so and would rather rely on a sort of low-friction private sector age assurance solution. But I guess time will tell.
Indeed. Who knows how this is all going to hash out in the end. But in the meantime, I very much appreciate you popping in to chat about it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Joel.
Thank you, Andy. Take care. Thanks again to Andy Lulham for sharing his thoughts on the world of age assurance. And thanks to you for listening. Find Verifymy at verifymy.io. And for all the latest news in biometrics and digital identity, be sure to check out www.biometricupdate.com.